Hello everyone and welcome to Millbank Tower on this cold and dazzling London morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled everyone's here today. And thank you to Nesta for inviting me to chair today's discussion. At the FT we're preoccupied and it's probably fair to say obsessed with the themes and questions that are highlighted by this research. So I'm very excited to be here today chairing the opening panel discussion and with our expert panel, who I'll be introducing shortly. Questions during the discussion. You can submit questions using Slido throughout the session, and you can also rate other people's questions during the session, and the most popular will be addressed in the Q&A session at the end. And we will also be taking questions from the floor at that point, so there will be a mixture of opportunities for you to contribute. Right now, I'd like to introduce Geoff Mulgan, Chief Executive of Nesta, who will present the findings of the future of skills employment in 2030.
Well, thanks very much, Helen. I'm going to give you a sort of quick overview of research we've done, trying to really dig deeper into what are the future skills needs which require us to act now. I'm going to kick off with a video, which will give you a bit of a flavour of what this is all about.
The conversation about the future of jobs and skills is one of the most important in education. A student entering formal education today will be making decisions about their career by the year 2030. But wait, we already know about the future of jobs. The robots are taking them, right? Let's take a step back. Anxiety about workers being replaced is rampant, but fear of automation is nothing new. Fears of technologically driven unemployment have arisen throughout the centuries, usually provoked by a disruption, like the Industrial Revolution. But historically, technology creates more jobs than it destroys. Of course, we don't know if it will be different this time, but we do know that automation is only one part of the story. Equally important are other interacting trends, including changing demographics, urbanization, globalization, inequality, political uncertainty, and climate change. What do we mean by interacting? Consider for a moment the following. Urbanization and globalization are trends that are interacting with and component parts of climate change, all of which are driving the green sector. Currently, the green economy is creating new jobs faster than jobs are disappearing in the polluting sectors. But in the face of increasing inequality, the high consumer cost of green energy could slow demand and job growth. In addition, investments in green technologies are deeply intertwined with government policy, making prospects even more uncertain. Understanding how these trends interact is clearly complex. It is also critical to understanding the jobs and skills needed in the future. That's why Pearson teamed up with researchers from Nesta and the Oxford Martin School to move the conversation past automation. Our forward-looking research combines the best of human expertise with the power of machine learning to understand the trends and make more nuanced forecasts than previously possible. What did we find? The future of work is brighter than you might think. And what's the best way to prepare for the future? We invite you to explore the future of skills employment in 2030.
So I'm just going to share a little bit of what this research showed and some of the questions it raised. And obviously, you heard the background is a great deal of media coverage, which is fairly apocalyptic. It says automation will take half of all the jobs perhaps in the US in the next 10 or 15 years. It implies often that there's nothing we can do about it. We're about to be sort of hit by a tsunami of economic change, which will be entirely negative. And we wanted to get under the skin as the video showed, of how these different trends might pan out, how they might interact, and what their implications are for what should be happening in schools, in employment, in universities today. The essence of the research was to break down hundreds of job categories into the skills which they're composed of, using expert groups and then machine learning to make predictions about what is likely to happen to those jobs in the future. And these predictions are all have varying degrees of uncertainty attached to them because nobody knows the future, but we've tried to be as rigorous as possible. This slide summarizes some of the patterns for the UK. The work was also done for the US, showing percentage likelihood of increased or declining demand for these key groups, such as professional occupations, trade occupations, and so on. In terms of the detail, this infographic, which Cath Sleem will say a bit more about later, then turns that into predictions. So many job categories, the more predictable jobs, jobs involving physical strength, are highly likely to be automated. That's probably not news. What's perhaps less obvious is the prediction of significant jobs growth in all sorts of fields, from food and hospitality and sports to teaching, health, elder care, and a fairly strong likelihood, as in the past, that job creation will be as dynamic as job destruction, which of course has been the experience over the last 30 or 40 years, even though many futurologists 40, 50 years ago predicted the end of work, that even then automation would destroy work. Now, a crucial part of the analysis was to look at what skills are likely to be in greater demand. This is a list of some of the top 10 using what's called the ONET classifications. And as you can see, and if you go further down the list, these are high-order cognitive skills, system thinking skills, as well as interpersonal, emotional intelligence, collaboration skills. And we'll be talking later this morning about the OECD's measurement of collaborative problem solving as a crucial 21st century skill. Interestingly, I think a novel part of this analysis, and this is where it gets, I hope, really useful, is to look at what additional skills might help someone in a current job to be more employable in the future, or help that occupation evolve. And as you can see, for customer service occupations, at the moment it's things like oral comprehension, if you're working in a call center, but in the future, if you can also have fluency, originality, perhaps the ability to respond to unexpected calls, that's going to be crucial to your employability. Or in construction, it may be, yes, gross body equilibrium. No idea what that is. We've all got it probably. But the ability to combine that with good sales, marketing, business skills may be crucial to your employability. So in some ways, these are kind of obvious, but they'll be really important for how training is provided the next 5 or 10 years as jobs are displaced from existing jobs. And the final one I think is quite interesting, how within existing business and management jobs, it may be the addition of creative originality, but also understanding of science may have a big impact on future employability. And another part of the analysis, which again I think is very novel, was to try and imagine what might be new jobs which don't exist now. But which, according to the analysis, look likely to emerge. Now, we couldn't precisely predict what those jobs would be, but we could see what skills mix might lie in those. And if you see here on the table, it's jobs which might combine things like fine arts, originality, design, fluency, visualization. You can probably imagine for yourself what those jobs might be. We also looked at what existing jobs are perhaps most like possible future jobs. And say one group of them, you'll see at the top, are jobs a bit like window dressers, artists, photographers, florists. Floristry is a really good occupation to be going into. Or for that matter, the combination of catering, management, supervision, chefs, and so on. So these are, so give you some flavour of a possible labour market of 10 or 15 years' time. Not all that different from today's, because one of the crucial lessons of history is labour markets don't in fact change very, very rapidly, even during the height of the Industrial Revolution. Although the long-term trends are very profound, they don't happen overnight. We have some time to prepare, and these are the sorts of jobs we may need to be preparing for. So in a way, sort of the message of this report, and I really would urge you to read the detail, because we think this is the most thorough study yet done anywhere in the world, in fact, about the fine grain of future skills needs and what that may mean to jobs. This crucial message is there's actually no need to be apocalyptic or fearful. There are huge, powerful trends sweeping through the economy with automation, AI, and so on. Many jobs will disappear. Many other jobs will change their shape. So, for example, waiting jobs in restaurants probably won't disappear, but they may require much more use of other skills and technologies. And new jobs will be created, and particularly in those functions, those tasks which are still harder to automate in health, in care, in education, in hospitality, and so on. And really the crucial question is, what do we do now? How do we create an education system which is putting at its heart the list of future skills needs which I showed earlier, and not, as it were, push those to the edge of the curriculum? And I suspect there's a consensus in this room at the moment. The core functions of primary and secondary schools are not focused, are not well aligned with what is already a fairly predictable future. And our task in this room and in this panel is to think through how can we better ensure our systems today are future-proof, future-ready. Okay, Helen.
Thank you, Geoff. I'd like to invite to the stage the two additional members of our expert panel. First of all, I'd like to introduce Sir Michael Barber, Chair of the Office for Students, and Lesley Giles, Executive Director for the Work Foundation. Welcome, Lesley. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to start with you, Michael. Could you give your initial reflections on Geoff's presentation?
Yes, well, it was excellent. It was a fantastic summary of a complex body of research, and like Geoff, I think it's certainly. I wouldn't claim to have read all the stuff there is on the future of work and skills, but I think it's an outstanding piece of work that the collaboration of Nesta, Pearson, and the Oxford Martin School have done, and it gets below the surface of the apocalyptic predictions. It gets below the surface of job titles and into the actual skills and sort of nuggets of work, as it were, that are likely to grow. So I think I think Geoff's summary of it was excellent, and I would just like to reinforce, first of all, Geoff's point about this time. It's not that we should be slow. There's a substantial degree of urgency, but there's time to get on and prepare for this. One thing I'd like to add to Geoff's summary that I was pleased to see in the report that Geoff didn't have time to mention is it reinforces the point that you shouldn't move from knowledge to skills. Knowledge is really important, and getting a body of knowledge and then being able to build it over a lifetime is fundamentally important, building on the work of, for example, Daniel Willingham at University of Virginia. So we need to avoid the risk of false dichotomies. So I always say that the road to hell in education is paved with false dichotomies, and there's a real risk of saying knowledge is gone, skills or attitudes ought matter. But actually, there's in this research very strongly knowledge matters, but obviously it's not all that matters, and all the things Geoff referred to are very important as well. And I certainly agree with the people who would say we're not currently in our school system preparing children for the future that we can fairly likely predict will be coming down the track.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to that point shortly. But Lesley, could you give me your reflections on Geoff's presentation?
Yeah, no, delighted to. Thank you, Nesta, for giving me this opportunity to come and talk about this piece of research. I equally am a strong supporter even of the research and what it has to contribute to the broader debates. As you know, has already been outlined, we're experiencing some real economic challenges in this country. OBR drew attention even more to the challenges around productivity. The Work Foundation does a lot of work in the area of understanding changes in the world of work and labour markets. We work with policy and industry. And what comes out time and time again is the important role that people have to make in turning that productivity picture around. Clearly, we have these mega trends, disruptive forces that we don't clearly understand. And I think where, therefore, there is an important piece of research such as this, which really starts to try to get under the skin of understanding these disruptive forces of technological advances and innovation, and really try to challenge thinking about what they mean. I think that's really important because, as Geoff highlighted, I mean, I've as I said, been working for a while in the area of work, and what frustrates me is this, in this information-rich world, and we have explosion of research on the future of work, we actually have a lot of noise. We have contributing to fake news in this area, in the sense it's very hard to actually navigate that, because the dominant debate is a very simple debate, that technology is just going to replace humans. And clearly that's not a helpful reality. And actually this enables us to have a more intelligent debate about the way in which technology enriches work, and that yes, it may replace some tasks, but the scale of tasks and jobs that are likely to be lost is probably not as significant as some of those kind of worst scenarios play out. And I think where we can combine some of this research alongside other experts, industry partners and policymakers, we can start to turn it into something that's really helpful. So if you saw recently the Made Smarter review, where industry leaders actually did further research to really get under the skin in terms of understanding the effects of the digital economy on key sectors such as manufacturing and what it was going to mean. And they clearly identified many areas that also this research touches on. And identify that actually, rather than losing lots of jobs, we're actually going to be creating lots of jobs, and that, you know, we need to do these kind of pieces of research to unlock that. So how do we use it? I mean, that's one practical illustration of how we can kind of use it. But clearly, I think we need to use this research alongside wider labour market intelligence. That's, clearly this is quite an extensive and robust and trusted source looking at a macro level across the economy. So if you can combine it with richer intelligence from the bottom up, it helps to see what kind of skill needs employers have and whether or not they're being met. And from that, we can see that we do have significant challenges already in our economy. If we combine some of this intelligence with sources like the employer skills surveys we have, employers are reporting significant deficiencies in some of these employability skills, if we've got a generic term for some of them, alongside technical skills, and those things really need to be met. And it isn't just about skill supply either, it's about demand. It's about working with businesses to more effectively manage those businesses, design jobs more effectively, and actually raise the ambition. And I guess the other thing that I would just end on is that Geoff mentioned schools, and I would also mention the fact that actually we need to be focusing on lifelong learning after people are leaving school, because we know that if we look at the working population, 2/3 of the population have already left school, the education system. And if we look ahead, about 9 out of 10 of the existing workforce will be in the workforce in the next 10 years, especially if we're going to be working longer working lives. So what are we doing, therefore, to strengthen our work-based learning routes and actually ensuring that schools, colleges, universities, private providers work alongside businesses in an integrated way to support people to continually reskilling and upskilling?
Thanks, Lesley. So I'm aware that in the audience we have a mixture of people. We have some education providers, we have policymakers, we have educators, and I'd like to therefore turn to practicalities. I'd like to ask each of you how you think we could practically use the information in this report to help individuals make informed decisions about the future of work. Geoff, let's start with you.
Okay, well, I think that there's a series of things which need to be done. Some of them we'll hear about a bit later, providing new navigation, data-driven tools to help people relate these trends to their own choices of subject or skill. I think there is a challenge for universities, which follows from what Michael said about combining knowledge and skill. So in the future of medicine, let's say, where there will be increasing use of AI for diagnostics and surgery, we will still need doctors with a deep knowledge of medicine. It's not as if they'll just be able to Google everything. But getting that mix right is different from what it is now. In schools, we need to combine knowledge acquisition with much more systematic attention to creativity, collaborative problem solving. We'll be talking about, and we've been doing a lot of work at Nesta on what that means in terms of practicalities in the school. And I think right back to primary school, I would love to see much more of the kind of making stuff where kids are learning how to be digital makers, to play with things, to code, but not just to code, because through doing that you in fact acquire a lot of the skills we're talking about which will be needed in 10 or 20 years' time. And that can actually start from ages 5 or 6.
Well, I thought I'd talk specifically about the Office for Students, given that I'm the chair of it, and it's a new organisation that first gets its powers on the 1st of January and will be up and running fully by the 1st of April. And we are going to actively, explicitly use this research to inform a key part of our work. The Office for Students is the regulator for higher education in England that will take over from the Higher Education Funding Council and offer starting on the dates that I just gave. And we've set 4 or 5 priorities, one of which is about improving the quality of teaching in universities. I won't go through all of them right now, but another of which is about the employability of students and the contribution of universities to the industrial strategy, to the growth agenda, both in cities and regions and the country as a whole. And this research is going to be seminal in that. I've spent, and we're called the Office for Students because in a sense students are now the funders of undergraduate education. Once they're earning £25,000 after they've graduated, they start repaying that. And so we're taking a student perspective, short, medium and long term, to bear on what an undergraduate education should be like. And when you talk to students, as well as when you look at the research on what students say, they say, we want good academic standards and we want to be employable. We want really good teaching. We want more one-to-one feedback on our work and all of these things. So that kind of perspective we will bring to bear. And in the debate about employability, we're setting up a student panel and we're going to invite them to play a part in thinking about the jobs of their future and bringing their voice to bear on the way we think about the university sector and employability. And again, just warn against false dichotomies here. Academic standards are really important. Learning the good, the true and the beautiful and history or whatever subject you want to learn is still wonderful and still important, but employability, students want employability as well. When I visit universities, I find that university leadership are very aware of this and indeed beginning to do some significant and very, very interesting experimentation in these areas with sort of guarantees of work experience as part of a degree, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot happening and we're a regulator, so we're not, it's not our job to make autonomous institutions do things, but we want to create the climate in which this kind of research is being debated, being thought about, not just at national level, but institution by institution. And indeed, I will pick up Lesley's point because universities can and should play a big part, not just for the traditional undergraduate, but for adults coming back into education and thinking about not just employability now, but in 5, 10 years and 15 years into a career and how you need to change and develop. So this will be, I mean, the answer to your question is we will be using this research explicitly. My colleague Geoff Fleming was involved in its commissioning when he's at Pearson. He's now working for me, thinking about exactly this. So it will be central.
So strong practical use there for
Yes,
this report.
yeah.
Lesley, how will you be using the research practically?
I mean, I think the key thing that I would emphasise is that, I mean, there's a particular series of skills that is in this area of continuing learning and relearning and how to learn, and I think that what that raises in this context of ongoing change is that we do need to have to kind of reinvent our response to learning or how we support that learning in new and more flexible ways. I think one key aspect, and obviously we need to do that in scale, the scale of this demand. We've already identified in some of the existing labour market evidence that we already have deficiencies in some of these things. So I think it's action that we urgently need to take now. In that context, I think the developments in government to reform our technical education programme is absolutely fundamental. And that started with a particular focus on apprenticeships, but actually is looking about extending pathways, right across from cradle to grave. So schools right through working life. And I think that's really, really important. And another skill that we've talked about a lot, but at the heart of this is collaboration, different players working together, because these are difficult things to work through. And it's also about, and I recognise whilst Geoff said, things are slow, at the same time, we've got to make sure that our education and training system is responsive too. So I think at the heart of that is more effective collaboration, particularly at a local level between businesses and educators and other experts who can really get under the skin of what's happening, what changes are happening, and what responses are required. So I think the technical education reform programmes that are supporting those kind of developments are encouraging greater employer leadership and involvement in education, working alongside government through programmes like apprenticeship programmes, and trying to also look at the way in which those systems are funded, and funding them in a way that everybody can contribute. So government has a contribution, but individuals can contribute, businesses can contribute. So we've had developments such as the new levy that's been introduced to try and enhance greater employer investment, and I think these are all important developments. So Work Foundation will be kind of working to support those reforms and try and make sure they're a success as much as we can contribute to that.
Geoff, I'd like to ask you, you touched on soft skills and how these are taught in primary schools, and obviously today's 7, 8, 9-year-olds will be grown up by 2030 and entering the workforce, which is a sort of scary thought for those of us with small children. How do you teach soft skills at primary level? How do you teach them at secondary level? And where in the world is the best practice?
Well, they're skills which are mainly learnt not by sitting in serried ranks in a classroom being talked at, like you're now being talked at by me, but through doing things, through working on practical projects, solving problems, and those can be, fairly simple projects in a primary school environment. In a secondary school, they may be more complex ones with local employers, with charities, but ideally real-world problems where you're using your disciplinary knowledge of maths and science and so on, but applying it to something in the real world. In my view, that's the best way to learn it. OECD, and we'll hear about this later, have actually been ranking countries, so they have an answer to your question on how well different countries do on collaborative problem solving for maths. They're not, as it were, real world versions, but maybe in time we'll come to that. To some extent, just one missing bit from our conversation so far, I don't think it's so hard for schools to do this because they have resources, they have teachers, they have a captive audience. I'm in many ways much more worried about the people who are already in the workforce, who may be now in their 30s, 40s, 50s, whose jobs may well disappear in the next 10 or 15 years, and what will happen to them. We've never had a very strong adult education system in this country compared to Scandinavia and elsewhere, and since 2010 it's been cut by about 40-45%. So at the moment, there's very little infrastructure to help people learn those additional skills, including those sort of collaborative teamwork, problem solving, the additional skills I showed earlier, which would enhance your prospects if you're in construction in a call center. And some other countries, Singapore's probably in the forefront of this, are bringing in much more structured both credits for individuals, tax incentives for companies, and really a whole system of both provision and accreditation to help adults retrain. France is moving again in the same direction with, I think, a lot more energy than here. And what's odd is we don't really have a clamour, a political demand for this kind of adult skills and adult training, which I think, this is one thing the public should be demanding, from budgets and so on, yet that isn't really happening.
Michael, is there a problem with approaching university level education purely in the context of employability?
Yes, there is. Can I just make one point?
Sure,
and I'll come back to it. I just want to reinforce Geoff's point. I think the implication of what Geoff has just said is we need a complete redesign of the welfare state, to put it crudely. And
by lunchtime.
Yeah, preferably. Well, the good news is that the new Vice Chancellor of the London School of Economics, Manoush Shafiq, who used to be at the IMF and before that at DFID, she's actually launching a whole debate about sort of beverage for the 21st century. She did her inaugural lecture on that yesterday. I do think that the way in which we think about the connections between welfare, education and work for adult life really could be redesigned in significant ways. We may not want to do it all at once. We may want to sort of muddle through in true British fashion of putting these things together, but it needs rethinking. And some of the basic building blocks of the welfare state are not really appropriate, I think, for the world we're going into. On university education, yes, it's really important that universities don't just become places of generating employability. That is an important part of it. But you do want knowledge for its own sake. You do want pursuit of truth and all the other things that sound grand and truly are grand when you do them well. And you do want the inspiration that comes from learning difficult things and achieving them. Just the pure value of that. And actually, if you look at the kinds of things that this research is predicting will work in the future, I think actually that ability to learn difficult things and work collaboratively to do those things will actually be part of the skill. So I think, again, we don't need to make a false dichotomy. The one thing I want to say that relates to, I think all of us have spoken about, but we just need to make explicit, is the risk is you could get most of this right, but leave chunks of the country or the population behind, both in the school system and in the university or vocational post-school education system. So there was a very good report, some of you probably heard it on the Today programme on Monday, I think, with Alan Milburn's latest report on social mobility, and some teenagers from Watchet in North Somerset, little town. Paper mill had closed, they didn't know what they were going to do. The University of the West of England in Bristol seemed an awfully long way away to them. They had absolutely no idea where they were going to get their best advice from on how to transmit that or what was required, all of that. So we could have a country where we get a lot of this right, but we leave significant minorities well behind. So when we think in the Office for Students about the future of work, we're also thinking about how to connect universities with colleges, with employers, with schools, focused specifically on the kind of young people I've mentioned who could easily be left out of the big opportunities of the 21st century and are being currently.
Before we go to the Q&A, I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Lesley, to give me 2 sentences. What's your call to action for our audience at national, regional or individual level?
I mean, I think my main call to action, sort of picking up and maybe challenging Geoff a little bit in terms of what he said, because, you know, I mean, I think we do have real challenges in this country in terms of our education, adult education system. And we clearly, you know, the hard reality, as Michael was pointing out, is that we do have a very divided already economy and polarised economy. We're leaning to the high value end. We're creating high value and high skilled roles, but we're also creating a lot of low skilled roles. And drawing on the OECD, there's a league table that we really don't want to be in, which is that in terms of our low skilled jobs, the proportion of our low skilled jobs that require just a primary education, we're second on that out of all OECD countries, behind Spain in terms of, you know, having that high proportion. So that's clearly something that, you know, another aspect to the challenge is it's about businesses too being more ambitious to then, you know, support those learning opportunities. But the reason I said I was disagreeing with Geoff and to lead that into kind of call for action is that I think we've got to recognise that we have been through so many reforms in some of these areas, so much. I mean, if you take technical education and skills area, over the last 30 years, there's been about 65 different secretaries of state. There's been about 28 different acts of parliament affecting vets. It's been moved around central government as a responsibility about 11 times. We've had the whole infrastructure to support industry, to drive forward better work-based learning. That's been changed fundamentally about 6 times. And we've probably got the weakest infrastructure for working with industry that we've ever had on some of these core issues and supporting collaboration. Yet at the same time, the OECD says that one of the problems we have in our economy is that we don't have very good collaboration. We don't have good diffusion of ideas and best practice. So how can we turn that around? So the call to action is that we have to start sort of trying to work together to support some of the reforms that are already underway. You know, we had an industrial strategy set out this week that, you know, has drawn attention to some of the opportunities that businesses are pushing forward in the sector deals, and that deals with some of the high value sectors. But equally, there's a lot of people that aren't employed in those areas, and we need to kind of be supporting developments to work with them too. And that means that we've then got to look and see how some of the technical education reforms around getting more people to undertake good quality apprenticeship programs and training we've got to support those kind of initiatives. So I think where there are steps through things like the National Retraining Programme that's being set up, which is starting to look at areas where there are particular pressing priorities, we need to be working together to try and make them work.
Michael, what's your call to action?
Lesley mentioned the industrial strategy. I was looking through it earlier in the week, and I discovered on page 101 that the Office for Students will be anticipating the demands of the future economy. So my call to action is, can you help us with that? And then but more profoundly, I think what I would try to urge is that picking up one of the points Geoff made in his presentation is to avoid kind of AI or robot determinism, and just take the attitude out there that we can make the future what we want it to be. And these things can be enormously important, helpful tools to fulfilling human potential, fulfilling human opportunity, and so on. And whether you're an individual or an institution or a country, you can take charge of this. All of those things are going to happen, but we don't need to let them break over us like a wave. We can actually shape the future, and I think this research encourages us to do that. And certainly we would want, as a regulator of the university sector, to be creating the conditions where universities take the initiative, use the autonomy they've got, use the relatively generous funding they've got compared to many other parts of the education sector, and really help shape the future, both at their institution, in their city, in their region, and on behalf of all of us of the country.
And Geoff, your call to action.
Well, one top down and one bottom up. So I agree with Lesley. Whitehall has had a terrible history of fiddling about, which hasn't been very good. I'd much rather we had a slower, steadier, more consensus-based shift of the institutions with power and money from the Department for Education onwards to align what they're doing with the sort of messages coming from this research. And that doesn't mean a complete restructuring of everything, but I think it is a crucial test of anything being done by the top-down institutions. Is it future ready? And then from the bottom up, I've about once a month this year done sessions with year 9s and 10s in schools, taking them through this research and really having a conversation with them about what does this mean for their lives. And it's clear that most schools do not have the capacity to have that conversation. It's not what teachers are trained for. You in this room do. So I'd urge each of you to make sure you are going to your local schools, and offering that an hour, 2-hour session with the children who are going to be living this future, and at the moment aren't being adequately prepared with the data, so the facts, and help in guiding them. What does that mean for their own actions? And all of you, I'm sure, have the power to change that.
Very good.
Thank you, all three of you. Thank you very much. We're now going to go to the Q&A, and could you please put up the questions from Slido? You've been rating one another's questions, and I'm going to put the most popular to the panel. So our first one is from Anonymous. How do we ensure that children from disadvantaged backgrounds aren't disadvantaged in gaining softer skills, given how important social capital is to those skills? Michael, could I put that to you?
Well, you have to make sure that in every school you get the opportunities not just to learn the formal academic curriculum, but be in a play, be in an orchestra, climb Snowdon, be in a sports team. And schools need to check that every student in the school is indeed having those opportunities where you do get to be able to learn those social skills. So in pupil records, you generally get the progress in various academic subjects, but what about leadership? What about collaboration? What about that? I think that needs to be done at the individual student level. But above all, the schools need to make sure children are getting those wider opportunities to learn, where you do pick up the softer skills in the way Geoff was talking about earlier.
I was just going to say also it comes down to the responsibility of the businesses in the local communities to connect with schools. I think, hopefully one positive outcome of the technical education reforms are that we're going to be thinking much more about work experience opportunities, and in a more varied way as well. So sort of taster days and, businesses working in their local communities, and, you've seen the developments of, positive initiatives that come out of that when you're kind of pooling resources and expertise and goodwill. And I think, encouraging some of those initiatives to blossom would be really important too.
I mean, this question about regional disparities in opportunity is, you mentioned the Somerset example that was on Radio 4 earlier this week. I'm also thinking about the book Janesville by Amy Goldstein, which is her on-the-ground reporting from the town of Janesville in Wisconsin after a big manufacturing plant closed down there. The lesson that she learned from her reporting in that book was that even when businesses go into a community and offer lifelong learning, it doesn't always resolve the problems and the inequalities and the poverty that can very quickly sort of erupt from old technology falling away and the failure of new technology to take its place. How can we work to prevent that? Geoff?
Well, we're lucky in the UK, and our economic geography isn't like the US. Even most of the poorest parts of the UK are within 30 minutes, maximum 50 minutes drive or travel or bus from places where there are jobs, there are employers. I mean, I think just for me, the key answer to this question is that the elite schools, or most of the private schools, are actually really good at both the formal academic stuff and the things Michael said, climbing a mountain, sports, etc. Many state schools serving poor areas have been pushed by recent policy to focus very much on GCSEs to the exclusion of other things. Those schools trying to have a different approach, like studio schools, UTCs and so on, have very much recognised that social skills, cultural capital, all those things are crucial for employability and work very well with local employers. But it's a long time since I've heard a schools minister talk about this problem and put this at the forefront of educational policy. So they're doing it despite, not because of, backing from the top.
We've got some handheld microphones around in the audience, so if anyone has a question, yeah. There's handheld microphones here and here as well, so if you're over there, please feel free to contribute. Question over here.
1, 2, check. I'm glad you raised the industrial strategy. Nick Causton from Steamco. Lord Heseltine was quoted in the House of Lords recently as saying that if you want an industrial strategy, you have to start in primary school. Geoff has spoken, fantastic talk around universities useful or useless. I can't remember, Geoff. Universities useful and useless. We'll give them that benefit. So my question is to Michael. Imperial do fantastic work with their festival. We're running a project in King's Cross where we're doing some work with St Martin's, Central St Martin's. I wondered what your thoughts might be around how universities might engage differently and more impactfully with both their local communities as well as inspire the whole country.
Shall I take the?
Yes,
so
please.
Thank you very much for look. It's a really big issue, and just to give university leadership credit, they are thinking about this. So it's not like there's that in general anyway. It's not like there's resistance to doing this. That people are increasingly in the university leaderships thinking about this, and I'm constantly learning when I visit universities about experiments people are taking on. But to me, the thing we need to think through, and Lesley mentioned this as well, of getting collaborations in a city or a region of colleges, universities, schools, employers, and maybe some other players to design pathways for age 14 to 24. So there's a much better flow through from, it could be studio schools or UTCs or whatever schools you've got, but collaborating and then thinking the pathway through from individual student level. You can. I agree. I mean, Lord Heseltine, of course, is right that you start in primary schools. The primary schools have got to teach reading and writing really well. They've got to teach maths well. They've got to introduce, as we were saying earlier, the social skills. But I think we need to get the pathways, the advice, the clarity of the flow through into employment much sharper and clearer. And I'd like to see some systematic experimentation in that area. And by the way, just one more point. I'd like it to not just be like if you're a top university, take Exeter, that I used to be on the governing council of, great university doing really good work. I'd like them not just to be getting people from Exeter and Devon, as it were, but in some ways finding ways of getting to the North Somerset coast, or and finding those students when they're 13 or 14 and helping them through. So encouragement to go a bit beyond your own immediate surroundings.
Any questions from this end of the room or here? Yes, over there. Could you stand up to ask your question, please? Thank you. And if you state your name and which organisation you're from.
Hi, I'm Jessica Chen. I'm from World Skills UK. Thinking about industrial strategy and thinking about what the panel has said, I think one of the things that we perhaps don't do quite as well in this country in comparison to, say, somewhere like America is that they have competitions to build a robot, competitions to do certain things across schools at a local level over there. Mike's gone. And actually, we don't have things like that in this country. So, in a way, the softer skills that we're seeking to create and build might have happened more organically if we did have initiatives like that.
So you're saying there's a lack of competitiveness in
It's
the
not
UK?
It's not competitiveness per se. It's more about the fact that how do we create conditions, which is what the panel was asking and telling us, to allow young people to acquire these skills. So what I'm saying is maybe in other countries there are examples of mechanisms that you do that. So typically in America, perhaps somewhere like, I don't know, AT&T may run a competition for local schools to build robots, and in that they may give specific definitions of how this robot would work, but actually, in terms of how you go about it, is completely up to you. So the teachers, the parents, the students all have to get together and complete a project. So I guess maybe the question to the panel is, do you see that kind of mechanism work maybe for UK schools? And if so, how can we help to build that mechanism?
Panel, what can we learn from that, Geoff?
Well, there are some projects doing exactly what you described, and I would promote the Nesta Longitude Explorer Prize earlier this year for 11 to 16-year-olds developing Internet of Things applications. It's not huge in scale, but it's exactly what you're describing. And I think you're pointing to one of the things missing in the industrial strategy, which was a really important piece of work done in the US last year by some of their top economists, which looked at 1 million or so inventors over the last 20 or 30 years, the people who created the patents which drove science and technology in the US. And the analysis showed you were much more likely to be one of those inventors, not necessarily if you were clever, but if you had parents who worked in tech, or you had an experience of a school which gave you chances to work in tech, or if you were from a relatively high income background. And in the US, they concluded the US was wasting a huge amount of creative talent because it wasn't giving bright, poor kids, those sort of experiences. And the economists, very unusually for economists, recommended shifting spending from incentives for venture capital, all the things which had dominated industrial policy in the last 10 or 20 years, towards primary schools and giving children experience of science, of invention and innovation from the earliest age. There was no mention either of the research, the diagnosis, or the prescription in the industrial strategy, which I thought was a big gap, because this is one of the most rigorous bits of large-scale data-driven economic analysis on innovation done anywhere in the world in recent years, and hasn't had any impact yet.
Time has run away with us, and we have 3 minutes left, I've just been told. Do you have a brief question?
Yes. Can you stand up? Hello, I'm Chrissy and I'm from UCL. Based on what Geoff just mentioned, how could you transfer this, mindset of building, making, being creative, exploring to primary school kids, where parents, teachers do not have it at the moment? Thank you.
Well, I think on anything like that, if there aren't, obviously long term, you want to build up the skills amongst teachers and the enthusiasm amongst parents. If you can't, then you have to bypass. And that's what's happened to a degree on coding and digital skills through the code clubs and other projects of that kind, which bring in volunteer capacity, now at pretty large scale, to complement what's missing in the school system. And that's probably something we'll need to do even more in the future. And one of the other strands of work Nesta's been involved in through the Centre for Social Action is much larger scale mobilisation of volunteers to help out in schools with everything from mentoring and coaching to the more specialised skills which for different reasons teachers don't have. And again, I know this is one thing we can all act on in our private lives as volunteers, be part of the solution to this, because all of you, I bet, have skills where an hour or two of your time in the local school might be incredibly valuable for kids there.
With the time we have left, I'm just going to take the most voted for question, if I could see from the Slido. We've taken the top one. No, the second one. We have levels, grading and testing for academic qualifications. Is it desirable or feasible to follow a similar path for non-cognitive, socio-emotional skills? Michael.
Well, look, this is you get some of that in what when you hear the Andreas session later on when they're getting into collaborative problem solving. They're at the beginning of getting into some of this area in terms of assessment, and you can imagine perfectly well the kind of environment that a computer game is becoming a place where you assess a range of skills, both academic and socio, emotional, etc. So you can imagine how that would work, and there are some experiments taking place in this area. So I think we will make progress on that, and they could provide really good information to teachers at some point. Have I got? I wanted to make one more point, not related to the question. Is that
please do.
Okay? Because we're about to wrap. One of the things that we, the Office for Students, will have the power to encourage is new providers of universities. So if you look earlier in the week, Joe Johnson, the Higher Education Minister, under the current regulations, so before our new powers come in, was helping open the Dyson Engineering University in Malmesbury with 36 applications for every place, really focused on the theory and practice and design involved in engineering. So that I just give that as one example. Hereford is going to get its first university. The Bishop of Hereford said it was the biggest thing since the cathedral was built in 11 something. So these are big opportunities. And the point, the question about the competition, imagine what these new universities could be like. The pathway will be clearer. The bar will still be high because a degree needs to be a degree. And a university education needs to be a university education. But the pathway will be clear, and it's a real opportunity for creativity.
I'm going to ask each of you to give a final brief reflection on today's discussion, starting with Lesley.
Okay, well, my reflection, and it connects the latter two questions in my head, but I think in my introduction I said about we need to reinvent learning and how we support and recognise learning. And so what I would say about some of the technical education reforms, which on the one hand are supporting collaboration, we do need to make sure that they don't actually reduce the space for innovation, for people to come together, particularly at a local level, and unlock that opportunity. I mean, if we look at some of the labour market information, we know that the greatest growth in learning is what government would call non-formal and informal. And that's the bit that they don't recognise in the technical education programmes, because actually what they're working on is to sort of recognise the formal learning, and that formal learning leads to old assessment techniques and delivery methods. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't, in our attempt to try and create quality, iron out all the room for innovation. And in that sense, I think we can look to other countries where they are actually using technology in a really interesting way to support people to not only do their own learning, but recognise that learning and accredit the learning and do more flexible assessments and bite-sized learning, which would cover. So at the end of the day, when you're capturing this through digital solutions, what you're looking for is a fully rounded, competent person. And that's obviously then a blend of, some technical skills and general skills and so on. So that would be the thing that I would emphasise is, can we kind of really make sure that our training reforms are allowing room for that kind of innovation?
Michael, your final reflections.
I thought I'd had mine, but I mean, I would say take charge of the future. Don't wait for it to run you over, as it were. I think that's the kind of underlying thing, that we can take this on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Geoff.
Well, the same in a way. I mean, the future can seem very unknowable and complicated, but in fact, most of the trends are fairly slow, steady, but remorseless. And as this research shows, we do know a fair amount about what's likely to be happening in 10, 15 years' time, maybe not 50 years' time. And therefore, anyone who has any power, whether you're a minister, a vice-chancellor, a head teacher, it's incumbent on you to be accountable not just for what you do in the present, in terms of quality of teaching and research, but actually how much you're doing now, which is preparing for the future. And those should be the twin structures of accountability for anyone with power in this field. And at the moment, we've got very strong accountability for the present, but remarkably weak accountability for the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all three of you, and thank you to the audience for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to work with you.
Thank you, Lesley. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Geoff. And I'm going to hand you now back to Joysy John.
Thank you, Helen. So we've heard about what are the skills required, what are some of the trends in the labour market, and what are the implications for policymakers, teachers, businesses, and you as individuals. So this session, we're going to show you some innovators and showcase some of the things that they are doing to bring about change. Now, these are going to be short presentations, and the Q&A is going to be in the lounge, and we're going to try and keep this to time. So one of the big challenges for Nesta is that we have this fantastic research. It's 124-page long, so some of you might not have read the whole thing. So our big challenge is, how do we make it really practical? How do we take it out into the schools and really help people learn from it and use that? So we also have a great opportunity here so that we can give people more info that is relevant and useful and that helps them make decisions. So on that note, I'm going to introduce you to Steve Preston, the creator of Skills Route, helping young people make better decisions post-GCSE. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. So I'm Steve Preston. I run a company called Mime. And what we do, we make sense of educational data to help schools and other organisations that are working with young people to improve their outcomes. Now, in 2014, we found out about a competition that was run by Nesta and the Open Data Institute called the Education Open Data Challenge. And we wondered, could we take this data that we'd been working with schools and local authorities and use it directly with young people? We were particularly interested in outcomes post-16. We've been doing a lot of work in that area. So we wanted to see if we could present, that same data in a visually interesting and engaging way and help young people make better decisions after GCSEs. When we researched this in a little bit more detail, we discovered some startling facts. So there was a great deal of evidence that the information and advice in schools just wasn't working. Ofsted did a review of careers education, which identified a lot of problems. Parents were saying they were dissatisfied with the support their children were given. And also we found some statistics that were quite shocking in terms of post-16 outcomes. So a grade C at GCSE is often used as a cut-off for getting onto an A-level programme. Sometimes it's a B, but there are a lot of C-grade students that move through to A-levels. If you look to the cohort of those C-grade students who went on to study AS-level biology, over 50% of those students were failing that course. So that's about, I think it was 54% last year, and that's a U grade. So with that information, we knew that there was something going wrong with the advice that was being given to young people. It wasn't just a teaching and learning issue. So we developed Skills Route. So this is an online platform that takes their students' predicted GCSE grades and also their personal priorities. So that might be job satisfaction or earning a good salary, or maybe at this stage they just want to keep their options open. It then shows them the different options they've got for progressing through post-16 education and supports them personalised information to make that right choice for them. And that'll be including things like obviously A-levels, but vocational courses and also apprenticeships. We found that schools were particularly poor at promoting apprenticeships alongside those other routes. And then importantly, it shows how those choices and the subjects they were choosing would then lead to different future career options. There are 3 tools in Skills Route: Explore, Plan and Find. They're also supported by a teacher toolkit. So this is a tool that can be used in schools. It analyzes information from the young people who have been using the tools and then shows them what that might mean for tailoring their advice and guidance. It also includes a risk of needs analysis, which shows the school which young people are likely to be dropping out, and again, to be able to tailor advice to them. So briefly, the 3 tools. Explore, so this is a learning tool which helps young people discover how their choice of subjects would affect their future employability, in terms of things like automation that we've been talking about today, and also answer questions such as how will my job options change if I get a degree. And we make it quite visual. There's lots of images. We call these little careers cards, or I think of them as like career top trumps almost. And rather than having an image of a person doing the job, it's actually got, because we don't want to reinforce those gender biases around having female nurses and male engineers, so we keep people out of that. Then we've got Skills Route Plan, which is the tool that shows all the options that are available to them and how they can navigate through them, and then again personalise them to the choices and their personal priorities. And then finally, there is Skills Route Find, which once they've chosen the subjects that they're interested in studying and the particular pathways, it shows them the schools and colleges that are actually offering those choices. So that's my 4 minutes on the dot. So this is Skills Route. It's www.skillsroute.com, and please do go on, take a look. Those 3 tools are all free, and we'll be very grateful for your feedback. Thank you very much.
About where these young people will end up. And let me tell you, the results are absolutely terrifying. So we think about prejudice in towards, I don't know, nursing and engineering we used earlier on. They're pretty good, actually, for the ones we have up here. So this is not a kind of a 55-45 swing. This is an 80%, 90% to 10% swing for STEM subjects between male and female across the country. Now, if we don't really address this problem well before we get to the point of saying, now choose a route, we have a problem, because people will not even be aware of the opportunities that are out there. The second thing that I always get on my high horse around is the north-south divide, where if we look at the aspirations of young people, north and south that line, they are just a country mile apart. In the north, if you're female, you will predominantly aspire to childcare. In the south, financial services. And in fact, that's a major issue, because in Reading, only 3.4% of young people are interested in a career in childcare. And that isn't right either. So unless we're understanding of this economy and the way in which people think, young people think, and influence them more effectively, we have a major, major problem coming. So we're obviously now looking at this. We're looking at how you minimise the unknown unknowns, to misquote an American politician, because if I've never met an accountant, none of my family are accountants, none of my teachers are accountants, why am I going to wake up in the morning and think I want to be an accountant? Unless we can expose young people to these opportunities systematically across the country, we're putting a major brake on the potential for both the young person and also for the UK economy. So we're spending an increasing amount of time working with LEPs, working with industry sectors to say, what is it that young people think about your business? What are their misconceptions? How do we change their misconceptions so that when it comes to that crucial point, when they're asked to press a button on a computer, on a digital platform, they're actually going in the right direction? Because the platform can very rarely point them in the right place. All it can do is help them go and take that first step. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. It's great to see that there are a lot of tools out there to help young people. And we've seen 2 specific examples. And now I would like to call upon Cath, Sleem, Quantitative Research Fellow at Nesta, who has built a prototype skills map to help not only individuals find their path as they're looking for skills development, but also help policymakers better understand the skills landscape. Thanks.
So I'm a data scientist at Nesta. So in my work I use big data and machine learning to learn more about 2 of Nesta's research areas. Oh, thanks. Education and the creative economy is what I focus on. So I create interactive data visualizations to communicate the findings. And today I thought I'll briefly show you 3 projects that all relate to skills. So this first project uses millions of online job advertisements from Burning Glass to identify the skills that are needed today by creative workers in the UK. I found that the skills in adverts can be clustered into 5 key skill groups shown here. But each creative sector draws on those groups in very different ways. So although we talk about creatives as if they're one group, there's actually no single creative type. And another finding was that jobs for creative positions mention lots of digital tech skills. These skills range from design tools like Adobe Illustrator to tools for project and contact management systems. So there's definitely some evidence for STEAM, that idea that creatives should also acquire some STEM skills in addition to art skills. And then finally, I found that there are some non-creative occupations that look creative because their adverts either explicitly ask for creativity or because the adverts ask for lots of design skills. And so these hidden creative occupations, they include several types of roles in engineering and also several types of teaching positions. The second project also used job adverts, but looked at all occupations. We wanted to examine whether we could help workers better identify the skills that they need to acquire, given that we all now need to be lifelong learners. And at the same time, could we help policymakers identify the skills that are becoming more important, as well as those that are becoming redundant? So with those two groups in mind, it's a very simple prototype skills map, just to show how job adverts might help. So the map's very simple. You type in your job title, and then the site tells you the skills that are most commonly asked for in job adverts for your occupation. It also shows you which skills are becoming more important and which skills are becoming redundant, and it shows you which occupations are closest to yours in terms of the skills that they require. The tool also gives a value to each skill based on the salaries and job adverts that mention the skill. So the tool just shows how big data, millions of old job adverts, can provide useful advice to both policymakers and to workers. And then finally, I just wanted to briefly mention my latest data visualization that Geoff showed. It's a visual summary of the results from the Future of Skills project. And this part of the visualization shows which occupations are most likely and least likely to grow. So the occupations that have a good chance of growing include jobs in areas like hospitality, leisure, jobs in the public sector, such as teaching and social welfare. The data viz also shows which skills are used most heavily in occupations that have a high chance of growing. These are the 21st century skills, and they show that workers will need a mix of both cognitive and social skills if they are to future-proof themselves against structural changes in the labour market. So that's it. We're going to be undertaking more work on skills in the next 12 months, probably with a focus on using big data to explore the skills needed by young people. So please do come and talk to me if you're interested in that, or if you have any questions about data visualization. Thanks.